welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. Tonight we'll be discussing whether free speech can help hopefully end some of the conflict between the sexes and what's been colloquially called the sex war. We'll be starting with an hour discussion with a few intervals for questions, followed by a break, followed by a full panel of free to ask questions. So let's get straight into it. A feminist, Lizzie Halden, a Peruvian-American lawyer with a past involvement in campaigns for the Democratic Party in America and a former university debate champion, and a non-feminist, Elizabeth Halden, a mother, a men's rights and gender equality activist, libertarian, individualist, and is currently working as a director of communications with the political party Justice for Men and Boys. So let's get into it. The first question: where does the relationship between the sexes?
Yes.
Sure. So, would you like to start?
Sure. Okay. A few years back, I contributed to an independent article which ended up being published under a title that was something like "Meet the Women Who Won't Be Celebrating International Women's Day." I wasn't the only one who complained, and it ended up being changed to International Women's Day 2016, What Women Who Don't Identify as Feminists Have to Say. I am an anti-feminist gender equality activist, and it's my contention that the sex war is a feminist invention that pits women's equality against men's in a toxic zero-sum game that is entirely distanced from what the majority of people who don't identify as feminists actually want. If you look at history clear-eyed and with love in your heart, what you find is that the balance for better that the organisers of this year's International Women's Day think is their original concept has actually been the predominant feature of our society for a very long time, at least until feminists stuck their claws in. Of course, there's been disadvantage and injustice. However, it has historically affected men and women in fairly equal measure. So much of it has been ameliorated by men and women working hand in hand and shoulder to shoulder, and, contrary to what feminists insist, in this society today, largely thanks to them, the sex demographic suffering the lion's share of disadvantage and injustice is not female. I'm here sharing the platform with Lizzie because I know that she's a good person who wants to promote meaningful progress towards greater human well-being, but I really think that her idea that feminism will help us to achieve that end is misguided. From the seminal text of the First Wave, the Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls, feminism has shown itself to be a grievance movement that myopically focuses on women's experiences and campaigns for privileges on our behalf, regardless of whether such privileges are moral or just, regardless of whether they drive a wedge between the sexes, and regardless of whether or not the majority of women even want to see men and boys disadvantaged, because you can't privilege one sex without disadvantaging the other. With the second wave, feminism really underscored the fact that not only was it a movement seeking to privilege women, but that in order to achieve that aim, it was going to foster hatred towards men. Third wave feminism is distinct for its inclusion of women of colour and their experiences, and that's a positive development. What's a shame, however, is that third wave feminists can't examine the susceptibility of their movement to being blind to, minimising, or even showing hostility towards the sexism that affects certain demographics, and realise that that's what feminists have always and continue to do with regards to men. In the interest of nuance, I accept that there have been and are individuals who identify as feminists who don't fit into the negative description that I've just given. There are feminists who want equal rights for men and women, equal treatment, choices, opportunities, feminists who have compassion for men and value them. But what impact have they really had on the trajectory of the movement and on the achievements of the movement? They've been marginalised heretics, pleading intelligently and rationally, but essentially ineffectually with their hysterical peers, while their hysterical peers have been lobbying our institutions irresponsibly and illogically, but consistently successfully, for policies and protocols that are damaging our society. Last Friday, I was planning to go to Winchester to see talks at their university by advocates for men's rights. One was titled, contentiously, Equal Rights for Men and Women. The other, Gender in History, Myth and Reality. Feminists caused such a fuss that the event had been cancelled. There was no direct threat to women involved, and the presentations contained no hate. Despite what the feminists claimed, they opposed the free speech of the presenters, just like they routinely oppose the free speech of the heretical feminists who refuse to hate men or advocate for them to be disadvantaged, because they know that their bad ideas can't survive the disinfectant of sunlight. That's what they're afraid of, some consciously, some subconsciously. A whole lot of feminists are afraid of free speech, and that's why I know that free speech is critically important to moderating feminism and ending the sex war they created. Thank you.
To Lizzie.
Thanks. Free speech has helped move mountains for women's rights, especially in the last 100 years in Western culture. In non-Western culture, free speech is literally only just now becoming available to women. Women are literally being imprisoned in Iran for refusing to wear the niqab, and in Saudi Arabia, women silently got the right to drive, only just as a point of utility, with approval of their respective husbands and fathers. Let's first focus on Western culture. How has free speech helped advance women's rights? The suffragettes took to the streets and used their voices to help women obtain the right to vote in a world that saw women as non-citizens and not even capable of formulating their own opinions. Their struggle was not without casualties, and the famous Emmeline Pankhurst said that women had to do the work themselves, and her motto became deeds, not words. But you can't get deeds without first using your words. Women took radical steps for their fundamental human right to vote. They stormed Parliament, they set fire to property, and they battled against the police. But who would argue that their cause is not a worthy one? At the time, they were imprisoned, ridiculed in the media, and killed. Through their bravery and civil disobedience, the suffragettes obtained women today the right to vote. That would not be possible without free speech. That would not be possible if free speech was not allowed first, even if it was stifled by the state when they voiced an opinion that was not in accordance with the terms of the day. In the 1960s and 70s, women used their voices to campaign for reproductive rights, a sexual revolution, and autonomy over one's body. They took to the streets at a time that was a perfect storm for change, with the backdrop of the civil rights movement and protest against the Vietnam War. Women burned their bras, and the advent of television saw women have their voices heard on a mass scale. Gloria Steinem went undercover as a Playboy bunny and challenged the prevailing attitudes towards sex, and argued that the sexual revolution at the time would only emancipate women, only emancipate a generation if women played a role in defining it. Angela Davis, a trailblazing woman of color, and the civil rights movement became one of the first ever pioneers of intersectional feminism. The end result was women won the right to choose in Roe v. Wade, access to contraception, and more freedom in terms of sexual expression and sexuality. Women's role in society was changed from just a mother to a professional, and gender roles began to be questioned. Fast forward to today. #MeToo and #TimesUp has given a voice to women who had previously been too afraid to speak up against sexual harassment and rape. This time, free speech centered around justice, or rather, injustice. In 2010, studies showed that 1 in 5 women had been the victim of sexual assault in the US, while only 0.1% of those victims reported the crime. It goes without saying that sex crimes such as rape until now have been de facto difficult to prove, due in part to the stigma surrounding female sexuality. But with #MeToo, prominent celebrities such as Rose McGowan took a brave stand against their perpetrators, which gave courage to other women to come forward and bring about justice. This time there was power in numbers, and unsurmountable evidence came forward evidencing the undeniable crimes of prominent men who had long been allowed to skate by, such as Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein. Free speech challenged the norm that it was okay to treat women in this way in the workplace. The Me Too movement is not just limited to justice for female victims. We also saw that the male victims of Kevin Spacey and Terry Crews were able to come forward and face their perpetrators. I think it's also important to note the progress of women's freedom of expression in respect of sexuality and desire. While male desire has long been an accepted part of society, that literally shaped how women can behave. Think the hijab and boys will be boys. Female desire is something that is still so shunned. Women's female form has to be hidden because a man can't control themselves, but women who vocalize what turns them on face rampant online abuse and slut-shaming. So where are we today? The numbers tell a story. 190 heads of state, 9 are women. Of all the people in parliament of the world, 9% are women. In the corporate sector, only 6.4% of CEOs of companies that make up the Fortune 500 list are women, down 25% from 2017. Women still face harder choices between professional success and personal fulfillment. Women in the US do not have any statutory maternity leave, paid or otherwise, and in right-to-work states where employers do not have to give a reason for firing an employee, a woman can literally be fired for being pregnant. Women's reproductive rights are constantly under threat, with Donald Trump threatening to overturn Roe v. Wade, and women in Northern Ireland still don't have access to abortion. Just last week, an 11-year-old girl in Argentina died because she was denied an abortion because she was the victim of rape and incest by her grandmother's boyfriend, and judges denied her application due to their conscientious objection. Here in the UK, it has only been ruled this month that menstrual health and periods should be taught to young girls in schools. Over 1,500 girls in Rotherham alone were the victims of grooming gangs, and only one case of FGM has ever been prosecuted in the UK, when there's over 4,000 reported cases of FGM in 2017 alone. Women are sold as sex slaves through forced marriages from the UK to the Middle East, and their rights are limited by their families and clouded by religious dogma. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done for women's rights, even in the West, and free speech has not been afforded to all women. Is this a result of the sex war? No. There's plenty of women oppressing other women, and there's women that victimize men. This is a societal issue. Just as my colleague here will bring up that there's plenty of issues facing men today, just as there are issues facing women today. I would stand for the injustices faced against men in the family court systems, just as I would stand up against a woman stand for a woman who's the victim of rape. We should stand together against injustice in all its forms. But just as the male victim of domestic violence is not given a platform, neither was that 11-year-old girl who was the victim of rape in Argentina. We should work together to address these issues that each gender is facing. This is not adversarial. I'm a feminist, but I'm also a men's rights activist, and I invite everybody in the audience to be both.
Thank you very much. Those were two very, very impressive opening statements. So we're going to get on to the first question. Where does the relationship between the sexes currently lie? And we agreed that Elizabeth would go first.
Right, okay. I mean, I think there's quite a nuanced answer here. And, you know, I recall watching Neil Linden on Newsnight. It was an episode called The Problem with Men. And the panel was mixed in terms of sex and perspective. But the audience in the studio was all men. And the young men there were saying things like, you know, there is absolutely no reason why you should ever touch another human being without obtaining consent, and things like this. And I found it really depressing because, as far as I'm concerned, human touch is a really vital form of contact, and you touch people to show camaraderie and for comfort and for fun. And, you know, also when you have romantic intentions, indeed. And I think, you know, there was the heretical feminists, the likes of Camille Paglia and Katie Royfer, back in, you know, the kind of Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon days, were arguing for liberated women who could contend with men and with life and with being in public. And I think it's a real shame that we've now come to a point where feminism is about women being weak and unable to deal with situations in which they're uncomfortable. You know, as far as I'm concerned, there are plenty of reasons to touch each other without consent, and it only becomes a problem once someone makes it clear that they're not comfortable with that, and it continues. However, shortly after watching this broadcast, I went out with some of the mums from school to a pretty working class kind of dive bar, and I watched the young people there flirting just like Me Too had never happened. And, you know, I had just come out of the toilets at one point, and a young man picked me up and spun me round, put me down and let me go. And it was fun, and it was funny, and it was like a complete different world to the one that the gentlemen and the boys, young men on television have been, you know, were living in. So I think that what we're living through now is like, I don't know if you've seen the movie Brief Encounter, but in Brief Encounter there's two stories. There's a story of a middle-class couple who have an affair, and they are very much inhibited. And then you have another story running alongside it about a working-class couple who are very performative and they're liberated. And I think we're going back to that, to be honest. That's a movie from the 1930s. And so I think that's where we're heading. I feel very sorry for kids who go to university, to be honest.
Thanks. So where does the relationship between the sexes currently lie? Well, neither side really understands each other, or worse, misrepresents each other. That's why it's so important that we inhabit these spaces and we use free speech to find solutions to common problems. When one sex loses, both sexes do. We need to help each other in our respective struggles, and certainly free speech to talk through it. I fully support bringing to the forefront of public awareness the issue of male genital mutilation, aka circumcision. It's a barbaric practice that causes fatalities and impedes on bodily autonomy of boys, yet people hardly know about it, especially where I come from in America, where it is a common practice, where the overwhelming majority of young boys are mutilated at birth. But we're not willing to talk about it. At the same time, I also invite my male counterparts to discuss women's issues as well that men would historically shy away from, such as menstruation and education there too. As I previously said, it's only just in this month in the UK become part of the curriculum that menstruation is taught in public schools. Men, I know that you're not comfortable about it, but y'all live with women, so you know it's not only something that's important for young girls to learn, but it can literally mean the difference between life and death for a young girl who doesn't know what's happening with her body. And I think it's very important that we have these discussions between the sexes. And to touch on Elizabeth's point about touch and liberated women, I fear that you may just be getting a little bit utopian about what is the current situation towards women. women are still subjugated to rape or sexual harassment. So obviously there needs to be a discussion about consent. I mean, we only saw recently that women were not able to come forward and bring justice against their perpetrators. So to say that that all touch is consensual, I think it's just a bit utopian.
Thank you very much. So, my second question. Do movements such as Me Too, Believe Women, and everyday sexism divide the sexes or bring them closer together?
Crikey. I mean, in short, all of those movements absolutely divide the sexes. And, I mean, they divide women as well as a demographic. There are many women who don't believe in Me Too and believe women and everyday sexism. To Lizzie's point that I'm utopian, I'll take that. If thinking that 99 times out of 100 men and women can work together and interact together perfectly successfully on their own without reference to feminism is utopian, then I'll take that. With regards to Me Too, that is a movement that has a body count. And what would you say to Benny Friedrichsen's wife, who has been in the press saying that the unsubstantiated allegations about him in the wake of Me Too led to his suicide? And everyday sexism, really. I mean, that's a joke as far as I'm concerned. The concerns that the women who post on everyday sexism have, in the main, are just so not even slightly serious. I mean, the idea of being distressed because someone gives you a compliment or, asks you out or something like that is absolutely alien to me, and I think women can do much better, to be honest.
So, as I said before, one in 5 women in America in 2010 were the victim of sexual assault or rape. So it's a real issue, So Me Too brought to a forefront what had previously not been reported. Previously, 0.1% of all sexual assaults had been reported. I'd say now it's a bit more. So a bit more justice for those victims is a good thing. It's empowered more women to speak up and not tolerate the likes of Weinstein and what people had collectively been happy to tolerate. The downside is that it does have impacts on women as well in the workplace. Obviously, unfortunately, men are now reluctantly shunning away from mentoring women. And I do think that that is a shame. But it also encourages it so that men don't invite women to mentor them in the bedroom or in the hotel. It encourages them to put safeguards in places that they don't abuse their position of power. I found that men are generally quite good at following instructions if women feel empowered to make it clear what isn't tolerated in the workplace. Usually women can't do this easily on nights out just for fear of physical violence, but in the workplace it is becoming a safe place to do so. However, you're still seeing that everyday sexism. As a professional woman, you don't want to be judged by your appearance. As Martin Luther King said, I want to be judged for the content of my character, not because of the color of my skin, and I don't want to be judged for the content of my outfit. I want to be judged for the content of my character.
So the last question before we open up for our first session of questions from the floor. How does the sex war relate to the overall lifetime earnings, freedoms, and happiness of the average man and woman? So, Elizabeth first.
Okay, so, I mean, the sex war has created a disadvantage for men in terms of opportunities and what's the word? Choices. You know, so the fact that we have a minority of university students are now men is certainly a product of the sex war, I would say, and that's not just going to impact on their potential lifetime earnings and also their self-actualization, but it's also going to impact on our future as a society, because we are not getting the best people necessarily for particular jobs, because we're judging people based on the contents of their trousers rather than, you know, their merits. And as far as women are concerned, feminism has spread this misandric narrative of men being oppressive and abusive, and I think it really confuses women, and, you know, particularly women who are in long-term relationships, you know, potentially with children, of whom I know many because I'm a mum, and in a long-term relationship or a marriage, you are going to come up against crises and conflict, and when women are saturated with all this feminist nonsense about how awful men are, it's quite difficult for them to be rational in those conflicts. And, you know, then we have the state, which, you know, is set up to incentivize women to leave their husbands because they're not going to lose any time with their children, they're not likely to lose their quality of life, you know, they're likely to be able to stay in their home, no questions asked. So, yeah, and the thing is, the women who I know who have divorced the fathers of their children, as a general rule, they're not happy. And I don't particularly believe that that was the right decision for an awful lot of them. I'm not saying that, you know, all marriages can survive. You know, sometimes relationships have to break up. But we're not having honest and fair conversations. And it's because of feminism. It's because of the feminist kind of monopoly on the family court system, on the media, in politics. It's making people unhappy, I think.
So the question was about overall lifetime earnings and freedoms and the happiness of men and women. Well, without feminism, women wouldn't have the ability to earn, period. But we've done a good job in bringing women to the workplace, but not a good job in bringing men into the home. Women are still expected to leave the workplace when it comes to rearing children, and that's at the detriment of both genders. This is where the gender pay gap kicks in, when women have to leave the workforce and men have to remain in it. I think both are limited in their choices, as women can still be seen as under pressure to have it all, or seen as cold and not maternal if they choose to focus on their career rather than start a family. Employers still look on women with suspicion at my age compared to men because they fear that they're going to go on maternity leave. This is not just at the impact for the woman, it's on the impact of society as a whole. It's been empirically proven with states where women are liberated to join the workforce. Those states actually have higher GDP, have higher wages, and higher productivity. You could be forcing the next Einstein to stay at home and take care of the kids, and the whole world can miss out on her contributions to society.
I was wondering what the panel thinks of hate facts. That is, facts that present statistics or truths of nature that we don't find to be socially or politically acceptable, as in the evolved differences in the sexes, for example, or the male brain and the female brain and such like. I was wondering what the panel thought of how there's a strong movement trying to suppress these sorts of hate facts and how these could play into the sex war.
Yeah, absolutely. Feminists suppress all of this knowledge, and there's so much literature to back it up, and yet the average person on the street has no idea. And so when the average person on the street is presented with the fact that overall women earn less than men, they think that there must be some malevolent cause. And it's not a new thing. Feminist censorship has always been a problem. If you read The Fraud of Feminism by Ernest Belfort Bax, which was published in 1913, he talks about feminist censorship, and the tactics were exactly the same. You know, any man who stood up and said, hey, you know, we have some disadvantages too, was slated as a misogynist and treated really badly, and, you know, they lost their voices.
I don't think that all women, all feminists think that a biological difference between the sexes is a bad thing. I think it allows for innovation within the genders to be able to overcome that. You see fierce women in the armed forces that overcome gender stereotypes. It's about overcoming those gender roles. That is liberation from the patriarchy, and that's freedom for the genders. You know, I mean, I'm a woman and I'm a lawyer, and I come from and 50 years ago I wouldn't have been able to achieve my position, but now I'm overcoming those gender stereotypes and those gender roles. And I think that feminism doesn't try to stifle that. It tries to overcome that.
I absolutely agree that everybody should be free to pursue happiness in whatever way that they see fit. But I think that the problem with the fact that feminism is censoring these hate facts is that women in particular are making uninformed decisions. So I've just started talking to a woman called, I think she's called Rachel Brock, and she has a successful career in science, and she's dedicated her life to it, and she's got all kinds of papers, but she's now reached a point in her life where she's saying, I wish I'd spent that time having kids. And nobody ever, mentioned to her that there are biological reasons why it might be good to start that part of your life young as a woman. And, you can always do the science thing later. She was very much pushed into pursuing a male kind of idea of success, which might be right for some women and, might be wrong for some men, certainly. But I think that feminism is really not allowing us to have an honest conversation about what works for most people.
So if that woman decided that she wanted to have kids later on, science has evolved to the point now where she can have kids later on. Women are having kids later and later, and they're able to still have careers. If that woman decided that she wanted to enter the workforce later, that would be at her own detriment. We've already seen with the gender pay gap, it's not necessarily a gender pay gap, it's a mother, non-mother pay gap. Women, their income significantly drops after they rejoin the workforce after having children. We shouldn't shame her because she wants to have a child now, because science has afforded her the ability that she can have a child later on.
I wasn't trying to shame her. I was trying to represent how she feels. and I would like to go on record as a woman who has a lot of friends who are mums, and say that, you know, after 35 it gets really difficult. It can be expensive and it can be impossible for some people. So I don't want it to be left on record that science has fixed the problem with women's biological clocks, because it hasn't.
Cool. So, one more question from this side.
Thank you. Mike Buchanan, leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys. A question for the feminist lady. In our 2015 General Election Manifesto, we explored 20 areas where the human rights of men and boys are assaulted by the state's actions and inactions, almost always to privilege women and girls. I'd like you to explain to us the areas where the human rights of women and girls specifically are assaulted by the state in Britain today.
Well, I've already brought up that until just this month, young girls are not being taught about their own bodies and menstrual health. With women and FGM, there's only been one prosecuted case of FGM in the UK. As I previously said, I would stand with you that I think that circumcision is a barbaric practice, and I would try to bring about change just as much as that I would hope that you would try to bring about change for young girls who are being subjugated to FGM here in the UK, where they are not facing justice. Another case, 1,500 girls being the victims of grooming gangs in the UK. How many of them actually face justice? Very, very small percentage of prosecution of those perpetrators of grooming gangs in the UK. We could go on and on. I don't think that we should be adversarial here. You know, I would stand up and say that there is injustice in the family court systems, but I wouldn't say that that's a victim, that's at the cause of feminism. I'm not over there making the legislation in the family court system, and I'm also not saying that circumcision should be practiced. That is not the goal of feminism.
Can I say there's not been one prominent feminist, to my knowledge, in the last 50 years who has publicly come out against male genital mutilation? Not one.
Well, I'd say that this is a very new topic. I'd say that it's not even being brought to the forefront of society in general. The men's rights movement is just becoming a movement in and of itself. I think that it's not mutually exclusive within the feminist movement. I mean, what feminists would say that they want suffering upon men just at birth, just in the same way that they wouldn't want suffering against women at birth. You know, it's not a core part of the feminist ideology. I'm here standing up and I'm saying that I'm a feminist, and I'm a prominent feminist in my own self, and I'm saying that I am standing up. So perhaps now is the time to change that. Perhaps I will go and speak to my feminist colleagues about circumcision, and we can bring about change.
Thank you very much. So we will have time for more questions later on. So moving on to the formal questions, the second round. So this half, Lizzie will be answering first, and Elizabeth will be answering second to give a fair way of doing it. So the first question: how does the sex war manifest in as far as how does the sex war manifest in the far less spoken about concept of toxic femininity?
Well, I think that women tend to hurt other women as well through their behaviors, through slut shaming and through their expectations of men. They're cutthroat in competing for male attraction, and they also don't reward the stay-at-home dad. I think that would be a fundamental way that we could shift the conversation in the home and put less pressure on men, and would also help women excel in their own careers. The famous Sheryl Sandberg, and CEO of Facebook, says that one of the key pieces of advice is to choose a supportive partner rather than a successful one. Make your partner a real partner. Split the traditionally female work with your male partner so both can succeed. We don't need to embrace the bad parts of femininity, just as the way that we don't need to embrace the bad parts of masculinity. We should reject frat culture just as much as we should reject slut shaming.
As an individualist, I find the concepts of both toxic masculinity and toxic femininity to be divisive and not that useful, to be honest. However, it is very striking that we have a massive social conversation going on about toxic masculinity and really, no corresponding conversation going on about toxic femininity, which, if women were as oppressed and, voiceless as feminists insist, I don't think that would be the case.
I think it's also important to talk about female sexual desire as well. So that's often seen as a part of what people would say is toxic femininity. Women using their sexuality to advance their careers or, at the detriment of other people. But at the core root of it, it's because female sexuality is seen as something bad. Yet male sexuality is something that's embraced in culture. A woman can't talk about her desires. A woman is slut shamed. I mean, I would agree with probably some of my counterparts here that I don't think that grid girls, the subjugation against grid girls was a good thing. If a woman wants to use her sexuality to advance her career, more power to her. Seriously, we should not be ashamed of the female form. We should not hide ourselves, and we should be able to express ourselves just the way that men are able to express themselves in that way too.
I think when you talk, and you've mentioned it twice now, about male sexuality being kind of accepted and liberated, I think what you're talking about is alpha male sexuality, and that actually the vast majority of men probably don't recognize the idea that they're completely free to express themselves sexually, personally. And I think that that's probably borne out in the fact that we have so many more female ancestors as compared to male ancestors, because men, who aren't topping dominance hierarchies simply don't reproduce. And as far as slut shaming goes, I would point out that that is basically a women's game. There was a study put out by NUS, was it? Well, there was a study that was put out that looked into it. The headline was that girls in schools were being slut shamed, and it was terrible. And when you dug into the data, it was girls who were doing the shaming. And I think feminists do it more than anyone. And you've mentioned the grid girls. I recognise that doesn't represent you, but I think that you represent a real minority in feminism, and not a powerful minority, unfortunately. I wish you did represent a powerful majority in feminism.
Let me ask you, how do you think that a Muslim girl in the UK can express her sexuality? Do you think that she can express her sexuality as some of the men here in this room? I don't think so. She can't even live outside of her parents' house. And that's not only here in the UK. And where my family comes from in Peru, you can literally not live with your male boyfriend until you're married. So the argument that men are not sexually fulfilled compared to women is just factually incorrect. Like, literally, women are stoned to death for adultery in countries.
So I wonder if women in Peru are not allowed to live with their boyfriends till they're married. Are the boyfriends allowed to live with them prior to marriage?
They can have as much sex as they want without any social cost to them.
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
It's called machismo culture. It's part of the Latino culture. Machismo. Macho.
Right. So, next question. Would you agree that if some men feel feminism is an attack on men as a gender rather than an attack on toxic masculinity and sexual violence, are they missing the point? Sure. Would you agree that if some men feel feminism is an attack on men as a gender, which, rather than an attack on toxic masculinity and sexual violence, are they missing the point?
Yes, I do think that they're missing the point. I think that feminism has been misrepresented as through harmful stereotypes. You just said that I don't represent the mainstream of feminism. Look at Emma Watson. She campaigns for education for young girls in countries where they don't even have access to the most basic forms of education. And she's one of the most prominent leaders of feminism. Yet here you are saying that feminists are all these men-hating, bra-burning. And yes, there are some feminists that are like that, but at the end of the day, we don't want a sex war. We just want equality of the genders. We want women to have equal rights to men. And as I've said before, clearly there isn't, in some ways, equal rights for women. I do believe it started off as equality, and I still stand by that, but the rapid success and perhaps prominence of feminism in today's mainstream media has perhaps frightened off men or women, and they perhaps don't know what the classical definition of feminism is, which is the equality of the genders. So we should, of course, call out bad behavior in all its forms, whether it's female or male. And so, yeah, if it's people think that feminism is just an attack on men, then they are missing the point. Because I would call out a woman who's falsely accusing a man just as much as I would call out those judges in Argentina for denying that 11-year-old girl an abortion.
Okay. In terms of, I think any man who thinks that feminism is an attack on their gender is entirely right. And I could go back right to the Declaration of Sentiments and the first wave. Emmeline's daughter, not Christabel Pankhurst, called men little more than carriers of venereal disease in one of her books. That was 1913 as well. But, you know, right now we have Susanna Danuta Walters asking why can't we hate men, and concluding that we have every right to hate you. There was a segment on ABC's Tonightly with Tom Ballard program, which you can find on YouTube. It features women thanking men in general for drugging and raping women and such, so on and so forth. Laurie Penny announced in response to the Capital Gazette massacre that we must not allow our society to be held hostage to white male fragility any longer. Then there was Barack Obama complaining that men have been getting on his nerves lately. I just think, brothers, what's wrong with you guys? What's wrong with us? I mean, we're violent, we're bullying. And then, you know, we've got the Gillette advert, which, I mean, it must be some alternate reality that they live in where uninhibited male aggression is condoned and pardoned by the mantra, boys will be boys. As a mother, I've never heard that said other than by feminists. But, you know, if feminism isn't an attack on the male gender, then at best it's neglect. So the brave and beautiful Emma Watson, when she campaigns for girls to have education, the unschooled population is 50-50 boys and girls. Why is she neglecting the boys?
Emma Watson was talking about young girls in the overwhelming majority rest of the world where they don't have access to primary school education, where girls don't have access to to clean tampons, and they don't have access to to any sort of the same luxuries that we have here today. So yes, there is issues that men are facing, or boys are facing here in the UK, but also we're neglecting the issues that women are facing around the world.
Sure. So, last question before we have a small break, and then we'll have an open Q&A afterwards. So, if you could, what advice would you have liked to give yourself, your younger self, regarding relationships between the sexes? So this is quite a broad thing, really.
So I'd say to myself, you'll be subtly subjugated to sexism in the workplace. You'll be paid less than your male counterparts, and you'll fulfill different work roles than your male counterparts who have the same experience as you, just based off of gender roles. But rise above it, lean in. 1, sit at the table with those boys. Don't be afraid. 2, make your partner a real partner. Don't be afraid to compromise for anything less. You should not have to fulfill those standard, stereotypical female roles in the home, because at the end of the day, both partners will lose because of it. And don't leave before you leave. I haven't had kids yet, but I've seen so many of my female counterparts who've dedicated their whole lives for their careers. They've spent countless hours in law school, have really flourished in their careers, and they really seem to be skyrocketing. And then they have a child, and then they don't come back. And I think that that's a real shame, because I know that they have so much to offer, but they feel that they cannot do both. And I feel that that's a real shame, because I see that they really are struggling with that. And that's what I would tell myself, so I wouldn't fall into those. And I hope that other women do as well.
To be perfectly honest, I've always had good relationships with men and women, and I wouldn't really have any advice. You know, I'd just say that I was very lucky to have had the unconditional love, because I didn't grow up with a father, but I had a great uncle who showed me unconditional love and really how wonderful men can be. And so I would just thank him and make sure that I felt gratitude for that. I think I always have, to be fair.
Wonderful. So we're going to have a quick break, 5 minutes roughly, and then we're going to come back for a Q&A. Thank you very much. Hello. So we're back. We're doing open questions from the floor. So feel free to. So at the back.
One of the things I admire about people on the left is that they tend to say what they really believe, even if this means taking risks. I have seen feminist leaders say honestly that the reason that boys have committed suicide in thousands, tens of thousands in the last 30 years is because of the destruction of the male role. Do you think all these male suicides were a price worth paying to get equality?
I wouldn't say that male suicide is as a direct result of women getting more rights. Actually, if you look at the statistics, more women attempt to commit suicide than men. So obviously mental health is an issue that both genders are facing, and I would suggest that we should be addressing mental health for both genders. I don't know where you're getting the causality that because gender roles have been changed, therefore men are committing suicide. Yes, there has been a shift of gender roles. And I think that we should be encouraging more men to take a different approach to those gender roles. We should be encouraging men to stay at home. I mean, a lot of the topic here has been talking about the family and about children. Well, what would be better than allowing the father to be able to spend more time at home with the kids? I think that's something that a lot of feminists would be able to get on board with, because a lot of feminists want to be able to achieve their careers in a way that previously had not been possible. So I think it is a crying shame that there is men committing suicide, but we should be addressing mental health. We should be addressing gender roles, getting more men in the home, and I think that would hopefully alleviate that issue.
Yeah, I suppose, as regards to does feminism have a role in the male suicide rate, I would just point out that the male suicide rate shoots up after divorce. And, I think you're right that a massive part of that is because they're denied access to their children so often. But, feminists with institutional power have not been helping. We've had Women's Aid producing the 19 child homicides report, which gave the false impression that any man who was accused of domestic violence within a family court should be considered a serious danger to his children and not given any access whatsoever. And with regards to mental health services, the NHS has one gendered mental health programme, and that's for women with postnatal depression. I think it's outrageous that they don't have a gendered mental health programme for the sex who commit suicide 70% of the time.
So if I could just add that you stated that the reason why men are subjugated to the family court systems in a position where at their detriment is because of feminist institutional power. 9% of all lawmakers in the entire world are women. So how is the feminist agenda encroaching on the legislature here? It's just not true. It's lawmakers that are implementing perhaps unjust laws towards men in family courts, but that's not because of feminism. That's because those laws are outdated.
Yeah, I have a question for my friend on the left there. Do you think it's true that, on my left, sorry, yeah. Do you think it's true that in general, women are treated as being less capable to deal with the severities of life?
Yeah, I do think that's true. And, conversely, men are assumed to be entirely capable, and if they struggle, they're not given support. So, yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that, women are still put up on a pedestal. Women have only just recently become able to fight on the front lines. I think in the UK, you still can't fight on the front lines if you're a woman, even if you can pass the same physical tests as your male counterparts. So, yeah, perhaps, women are seen as not able to handle the same everyday stresses as their male counterparts, which I think is at the detriment to women, because we're fierce, and we should be empowering women to handle those obstacles which we will face. There are definitely still issues that women will face, and just like how men will face their own issues, and we should be empowering them. There's a phrase in Spanish that is "si se puede," yes you can, Yeah, and same was used in the Obama campaign. Yes, we can. And I would empower both men and women to embrace that. Yes, we can.
What's the question?
Hi there. Hi there. The question is, do you think that the backlash against feminism going on at the moment, backlash against the Me Too movement, is because men haven't quite caught up with the fact that feminism has changed from individual, aka third wave feminism, where women were encouraged to be strong in order to bat off unwanted advances in the Catherine Deneuve manner. So now from there, it seems to have moved to a social feminism, where it's not to do with individual strength, but it's to do with empowering everyone, even the disadvantaged people like the great seducer Dominic Strauss-Kahn beat on in the hotel.
I think that you brought up some good points. Yes, in a way, it has become a social feminism that highlights the issues that victims are facing versus before saying that women could perhaps overcome and bat off those advances, which not always times is the case. Unfortunately, men do have biological differences, like as somebody previously brought up. So, it really would be kind of utopian to say that, a woman should always just stand up and laugh off a man's approach, or that she should tell him where to put it, when a woman's life can literally be put in danger for doing that. So this new wave of feminism has highlighted those perhaps vulnerabilities of women in today's society, especially in the justice system, where there is such social stigma for sex crimes. And it's not just female victims of sex crimes. As I previously brought up, one of the biggest parts of the Me Too movement was Kevin Spacey being brought to justice by his male victims. And so this new movement of feminism is about justice or injustice, and about bringing a voice to those victims, not just, as Elizabeth said, about the middle class victims, but hopefully now also those working class victims as well. You see with the grooming gangs and the working class victims that were involved there. I heard on the TV the other day that they were described as, I think it was a social, a lifestyle choice, that those victims were described as a lifestyle choice. That is telling. Those girls were not, some of them are 9 years old. Lifestyle choice? There's still work to do.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to remember the question. It was about, is the backlash because men haven't...
Former type of feminism.
Is it against the former type of feminism?
An individual type of feminism where women became strong, as opposed to, this is more an inclusive social feminism, which is to do with justice and equality.
Right. I actually think, the third wave, and I've resisted accepting that we've moved into a fourth wave for quite a while, until I came across some quotes from Naomi Wolf and Rennie Denfield, who are both complaining about the new cult of victimhood that we see in feminism today. So I think it has changed since the 90s. And I think that, fourth wave feminism and third wave feminism as well, that's something they've got in common. They're both very inclusive as long as you can identify the problem as being white men.
question.
So I just want to bring it back to the title of the topic. Can free speech in particular end the sex war? Because that's preferable than perpetuating a sex war for years immemorial, right? So an example of free speech actually having an impact or a dent against the sex war was brought up. I was chatting with Mike on our way out to the toilet, and he said that he's been at the avant-garde of gender equality for decades now. And he said he had never heard a feminist take a stance against male genital mutilation. And I said, well, there's one on stage, right? Which is good news. Now that only came to be because of free speech. That conversation wouldn't have happened, and I couldn't have that conversation with 99% of feminists, but I can with this one because we inhabit these spaces where we can actually use our free speech and have these conversations. I fear that when the two viewpoints exist only in a vacuum, nothing happens. So the question I'd like to ask of both is, from the other side, as much as there is another side, what would you want in terms of ending the sex war? What would be the big power play, the big power punch that you could get from the other side to end the sex war?
I think, so free speech is critical, and feminists have monopolized the speech that's available, in terms of the public sphere. So they really need to take a step back and, set out a load more chairs for the majority of the public, actually, because only 7% of the public in total are feminists. And I don't think the other 93% are represented at all. And the other thing, with regards to free speech, is that I think that there should be standards, and I'd like feminists, not you, but other feminists, to stop lying. They lie about the gender pay gap, they suppress the hate facts, and, spread the idea that women are discriminated against. They inflate stats suggesting that women are at risk from men. They minimize the real risks to men's safety that are out there, and they spread this revisionist history. For example, my boys are at primary school, and they were taught this year that it's 100 years since women got the vote. They weren't taught that it's 100 years since working class men like you got the vote. So, free speech and truth.
I mean, absolutely. I think that free speech is critical in bringing people together. I've learned so much from men's rights activists. I've learned the brutalities about circumcision. And I think that, unfortunately, on the other side, I think that y'all get very bogged down in labels. I hear everybody blaming feminism for everything from circumcision to the family court system, yet you just said that only 7% of people identify as feminists, so how could we be dictating all of this? Feminists are not the root cause of this, and I think that we should be all talking together in order to be able to bring about change, because we're not each other's enemy. I mean, we've found a lot of common ground here, and I think that we all could, if we look past the label of, feminist or non-feminist, that we can find a lot of commonality here. But I do think that these labels do bog down people. So, I mean, when you said revisionist history, I mean, there is a lot of history that shows that women have been subjugated. So I think it is important to remember that, because only 100 years is the difference between when working class men got the right to vote and also women got the right to vote as well. So we should learn from that. We shouldn't repeat those mistakes, because it's issues that are still facing us today. Like I said before, education for women and for young girls, just as education for young boys in the UK, is very important. This is things that we should take our voices to. So yeah, I think that free speech, we're all sitting here together. We've all learned a lot about a lot of the different issues that are facing each gender today. We shouldn't get bogged down in labels. We shouldn't be adversarial to each other. And I think if we do that, we can overcome a lot of these issues. I really hope that the men in this room are not the worst toxic masculinity that is represented in society. And I would hope that you don't portray me as that toxic feminist who's burning the bra. And I hope that you learned some things from what I had to say today, and I've learned some things from what my counterparts have had to say here today.
Any more questions?
Okay, so I just came along rather late, and I'm sorry about that, but I very much think that we need more of this, but I think it needs to be designed particularly to attract older men and women, because I know that there are some people over 40, 50 here, but people who are, perhaps they were hippies like myself. We went through a lot of this stuff in a different kind of way, in a kind of more open-hearted, loving way. And I think we seem to take ourselves very seriously these days in a rather boring way. And I notice how people dress. I mean, look at me. I just can't get over loving color. And maybe I absorbed that, in the 50s, but and into the 60s. But I think that we are a very dull lot.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just making a statement at the moment. Is that all right?
That's perfectly fine. I'm just curious.
Okay. No, maybe I'll eventually get to a question, but I think I'm posing a question by making this statement. And I'm encouraging people to invite people like me to think and to act out our fantasies of being more loving and listening, and to be more courageous and ridiculous. And I'm just making that suggestion and inviting myself to the party. Thank you.
Welcome. Did you have any remarks on that?
Yeah, I am very much attached to the music of the 60s and the 70s, and a lot of my friends hail from that period as well. And I think that the true kind of egalitarian legacy and free-spirited and fun legacy of the 60s and 70s, I think it does seem to have been lost, and that's a great shame. So thank you for your comment.
Well, I think that you look absolutely fabulous, and I love your bright colors. I too, myself, I'm a big fan of bright colors. I think that the world can do with more bright colors and more art and more expression. And I think that we can learn a lot from your generation. Your generation were pioneers for women. Your generation brought about a revolution in music and in society, and we would be ill-placed to forget that. And it's not too long ago, your generation fought for the civil rights movement. It fought for women to have access to contraception. And that's my parents' generation. That's not too long ago. That's still in living memory. So I think I'm very appreciative of your comment. I think it's refreshing. I do think that sometimes we could get so bogged down in what's negative in today's society, and we should bring together, I know that you stand for this organization, Justice for Men and Boys, and the women who love them. And I think that that's great. I think that, all women have men in their lives that they love. Not all men are toxic rapists. But we should we should embrace the men in our lives. We should teach them to be better because we love them, and the same for our sisters and our mothers as well.
Cool. Next question.
And I suppose in the spirit of free speech, I'll take it as far as I can while questioning free speech itself. So I'd question free speech because, especially in today's, world where everyone's on Twitter and there's a lot of labels being used from both sides of the argument, and there's very little argument apart from labels, and people are being quiet then because they don't want to be called such and such. But I suppose my question is, when you give free speech, for example, to someone, and this is extreme, but and many of you won't welcome it, but for example, to a person who would maybe entertain the idea of paedophilia, but we will give them free speech for the sake of it. Is that, of course, it's dangerous because it could start off something where people will, act on it. Do you understand? But that wouldn't happen probably in this case. But in the case of Donald Trump, where he, made a remark that's, harmless in his words, but could these words not lead to maybe, whether it's a microaggression, could lead to further aggressions that could be of an attitude related to that, whatever he said. So basically, I'm just saying, words can put thoughts in people's minds, and then bad actions can come of it, and that's what I'd be afraid of with free speech. And I don't know if maybe you'd have something to say against that. And the last thing is touching, relatively harmless, but again, and there's a whole politics surrounded microaggressions and things like that. But my question is, these little small things can give a sense of entitlement, do you understand, that could really be harmful in the long run, and that's what I'd be afraid of.
Okay, so there's quite a lot to get into there. I presume when you mention Trump, what you're talking about is his grab him by the pussy comment. And I think that we generally tend to miss out the bit where he says, and they let you. He was talking about consensual experiences with that comment. And your concern is that a sort of powerful person saying that could spread misogyny?
Yes,
yeah.
I'm leaving it out on the event because regardless of what the words were, it was an attitude. It was a smirk in essence. And it was perhaps...
Yeah, I mean, bearing in mind, he didn't stand on a platform and say that it was a recording that was leaked. So, I think there are times and places, in his explanation that it was locker room talk, I think is quite fair enough. But no, I don't think that free speech is dangerous in that way as long as there is a balance. So as long as there are people, on both sides who, I think, sunlight is the best disinfectant, really. And there was another part to your question too. What was that? Touch, of course. Okay, yeah. So, no, I reject the idea that the vast majority of people feel entitled to one another's time and bodies, whether they're men or women. I can only speak from my personal experience, but whenever I've been romantically interested in someone and approached them, I haven't felt entitled. I've felt nervous, and I felt like they had all the power to either accept my advances or reject them. And I suspect that men feel the same, although I could be wrong. You let me know.
So I think it's quite telling that you called it just locker room talk, because that means that men talk like that behind women's backs, and that's acceptable. It's just locker room talk. So why are men talking like that behind women's back? He said, and they let you, not because they wanted it, but because he was in a position of power and he could get away with it. So yes, I do think that we should call out that kind of behavior. If men are talking about, their latest conquest in the locker room, and slut shaming that girl, men should stand up and call that out as being inappropriate behavior. That would be a good way to combat toxic masculinity. Just, as you would if you're hearing a woman say the same, but you don't hear women in the locker room talking. Free speech and calling those inappropriate things out, I think we should definitely allow those things to be aired, because otherwise it would just go underground. And then they would see themselves as being persecuted and give them even bigger of a platform to be able to go against what they want. Like incels, like men saying that they're entitled to sexual entitlements from women. It's absolutely abhorrent, but they voice it on the internet, and we can see it, and we can call it out. If we were to screen them, then they would think that they're being persecuted, and then perhaps gain more numbers for their views.
So I've got a question. I'm part of the Free Speech Group organising committee, and looking around I can see that people have really enjoyed tonight, and it feels very productive having two, at times opposing views. And a few people have said, well, why don't we do this more? But what I'd just like to tell everybody is that as part of the committee, we probably emailed 25 feminist organisations to try and get somebody up on that table to be with Lizzie there. Ideally, we were going to have a much bigger panel, but none of them were prepared to do it. Yeah, sorry? Yeah, exactly. And so my question is, why is it so hard to get the two opposing sides to sit down and have a conversation if one side is not prepared to come to the table?
Okay, when I was a feminist at one point, and then I started talking to feminists, and it quickly put me off. And while I was questioning some of the things they were saying, because they really didn't seem to represent the dictionary definition of feminism and what I thought it was about, I started bumping into men's rights activists and so on, and they seemed to make a lot more sense. And this was a couple of years ago, and at the time I would say tweet a prominent feminist and ask her a question, and she would respond to me. These days, and I cannot stress how polite I am, I get tumbleweed, and as far as I can gather, it's because they don't want to give us any oxygen, because they're aware that when they talk to opponents of feminism, they're not coming out very well. And that's why I think, not necessarily you. I mean, we did have a little interaction, and I said, it would be fine to reject the idea that there's a sex war. That would be an interesting perspective. But obviously, if you weren't here, that's different. But a lot of other groups just ignored me entirely. And it's definitely different at this point than it was in 2016. Yeah.
So when I went to an event put on by yourselves, Justice for Men and Boys, for International Men's Day, I got the courage to go up there and ask a question. And literally within the first few words out of my mouth, I was heckled, I was booed, and I was deplatformed. And I still had the courage to go on, and what my end sentiment was that feminism and men's rights activism is not mutually exclusive. So actually, I was going up there with quite something good to say. So that I think that some men's rights activists could perhaps get on board with. But I think that that's perhaps one of the reasons why other feminists decided not to attend today or to be involved today, because it took a lot of guts for me to come up here, knowing that this was going to be put on by the by Justice for Men and Boys, and that, and after my experience in, well, sorry, but you invited me, and you know, I knew that you had your following, and my previous experience with that. So, you know, perhaps that's the reason why. And I think that that's really at the detriment of free speech. So perhaps we can stop labeling each other as opposing viewpoints. I mean, that's another one of the reasons why I think, you know, other feminists didn't get involved. Like my friend over here said, is that the wording of the concept was sex war. You know, that's automatically putting each other on opposing sides instead of bringing people together to try to work together to find a common solution.
Cool. Well, I'd just like to preface and say that we created this group as a kind of open platform for multiple sides to speak. It wasn't deliberately supposed to be in any direction, really. It was more just an open area where we can have free discussions, where it's not really locker room talk. It doesn't have to be. It's like actual open debate. You know, it's not feminist. It's not anti-feminist. It's got no agenda, and it's simply a free, open area to debate. So. I think that the kind of accusations that this is kind of like a frame, that we framed it, that was totally unintentional. We used the terminology here because of the quotes that we saw in Germaine Greer's work, and that kind of frame has been put forward by feminists for years. But on to the next question. Jeremy, please.
Thank you. So I'd like to make a statement and then about what I see as a lack of depth in the discussion and conversation here. Because from what I've seen, it has been accepted that equality and freedom for the sake of freedom and equality for the sake of equality are goods in and of themselves. And our ultimate goal here is to create an environment in which people can just do whatever they feel like doing. And while it may seem at the face of it to our modern sensibilities as being the ultimate good, I'd like to raise up the issue that the modern conception of freedom, sexuality, and equality, the addition of the woman as an integral part of the workforce, and basically the destruction of the nuclear family as a concept is detrimental to a nation. And we can see this by the declining birth rate of any nation that has embraced these ideas, which is in general in our modern world the white European cultures mostly. And from what you will see, to counteract this fatal trend, these nations have resorted to taking in members of other nations, which again, on the face of it, may seem fine, but you will notice that to be able to export their own members, because these nations are able to multiply and export their members, they are essentially traditional nations that don't embrace your modern ideas. So I'd like you to address this fact that your ideology is basically killing a nation and importing people that are against this ideology.
Elizabeth?
Wow. I think that's a really interesting spanner to throw in the works. And it's not just a decline in birth rate, it's also declining self-reported rates of happiness that we're seeing. And I'm a libertarian, so as far as I'm concerned, freedom is a good in itself. It's not a means to an end. But I would very much advocate for informed freedom and for people to have all the hate facts at their disposal and to be aware that, you know, the traditional kind of setup wasn't imposed upon us. It grew organically out of what was useful, really.
So those people are coming from other parts of the world where those rights are not enshrined. You look at the mass immigration to the UK from countries such as Pakistan and Bangladesh, where women are literally not even given the right to have access to reproductive rights, having access to education. So yes, I'd say freedom for freedom's sake here in the West is a great thing, and I would argue that more freedom for freedom's sake around the world should be promoted.
Thank you. I don't think we have any more time for questions, unfortunately, but thank you for coming, everyone. It was a very interesting time. Any closing remarks from the both of you?
Can I at some point just make a little announcement about something which is about to happen?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So you didn't have any closing remarks, or?
Just real quickly, I would just say to get back to the concept of free speech and whether or not that can bring us all together as men and women and the issues that we face. Absolutely. I think have seen today that there's a lot of common ground between feminists and men's rights activists if you get over the labels. So as I would campaign for against circumcision for boys, I hope that you would campaign against female genital mutilation for girls. And we're here sharing these ideas, and I think that that's a great thing, and I'm grateful to be here.
I suppose I would like to maybe just make a point to your point about there not being a sex war. Yeah, and also relate it back to the quote that you had from Emmeline Pankhurst, that women had to do the work themselves. I'd just like to point out that they didn't. We had loads of men advocating for women's, right to vote at the time. There was Jeremy Bentham, Henry Fawcett supporting Millicent. John Stuart Mill was elected by men on a platform including votes for women, and obviously the MPs who voted through the bill, the Act, Representation of the People Act, were all men. And so, why was Emmeline spreading this idea that women had to do it themselves? She must have known very well that they weren't. It was not a war, it was progress shoulder to shoulder.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of our speakers, Elizabeth and Elizabeth.